punch in the throat. That could kill her, right? And the WNBA, right? The people that run that league, if you're Dijonai here and you have a foul like that, I don't want to hear about, okay, that's a flagrant 2 and you get this sort of fine. She should be suspended for the rest of the season because this isn't, as you said, Tommy, a whoops. This is intentional. This was targeting Sophie Cunningham, and I don't care if the player is white or black. It does not matter. When you do this to somebody, this is horrible for the league. Obviously, this was done because Sophie Cunningham stood up for women, saying that men shouldn't play against women in.
Dijonai Carrington has been officially banned after the assault on Sophie Cunningham, and the WNBA has sent the strongest message in the history of the league's disciplinary framework, and the basketball world is processing what happened as the most institutionally significant single disciplinary outcome the Clark era's governance accountability story has produced. Not simply because the official ban represents the most severe disciplinary consequence in the league's institutional history, but because the specific combination of the conduct that produced it, the institutional context in which it arrived, the accountability coalition pressure that preceded it, and the formal institutional language the WNBA has chosen to accompany the official ban announcement together represent a governance moment whose significance extends far beyond the individual disciplinary action into the permanent institutional architecture of how the WNBA's governance apparatus understands and enforces its physical conduct standards going forward. The official ban has been issued. The strongest message in the league's history has been sent. And the basketball world is now asking the most important governance accountability question the Clark era has ever generated, which is whether the strongest message in the WNBA's history is strong enough given everything the season has documented about the governance failures that created the conditions for the assault to be possible, and what the specific institutional content of the strongest message tells you about how completely the governance apparatus has processed the full scope of the accountability coalition's demands rather than simply the specific severity of the individual incident that produced the ban. Today I am breaking down exactly what the official ban involves and what the specific institutional language of the strongest message in WNBA history communicates, why the official ban's timing and content relative to the accountability coalition's accumulated pressure tells you more about the institutional processing behind the governance decision than the headline of the ban's severity alone can communicate, what the WNBA's institutional communications around the ban reveal about whether the governance apparatus has addressed the governance framework failure dimension of the accountability coalition's demands or simply the individual conduct dimension that the ban most directly addresses. And what the entire sequence from the Carrington assault to the ban to the strongest message in WNBA history tells you about where the governance accountability story has arrived and what it still needs to accomplish to produce the institutional transformation the Clark era's most consequential governance season has been building toward. And stay with me because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of the official ban announcement that the mainstream coverage is treating as the confirmatory conclusion of a governance accountability story that is now complete when it is actually the most important indicator of how much of the governance accountability story's most important institutional work is still ahead rather than behind. The official ban of Carrington following the assault on Cunningham arrives in the most institutionally charged governance accountability context in the WNBA's history, and understanding what the ban's official announcement means requires understanding the full arc of the governance accountability story the Clark era has built across its most dramatic season rather than evaluating the ban in the institutional isolation that the surface-level dramatic framing of the strongest message in WNBA history invites. This channel has covered the entire arc of that governance accountability story in the preceding series of videos, from the physical targeting of Clark that the reporter's bias investigation documented, through the Cunningham DNA-proof ban that produced the most institutionally revealing single disciplinary decision the governance apparatus made before the Carrington assault, through the involvement of the Accountability Coalition's most institutionally significant voices including LeBron James, Charles Barkley, Steph Curry, Cheryl Miller, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan, through the lifetime suspension announcement that preceded the official ban's formal confirmation, and through the specific institutional dynamics that each escalating governance accountability development has added to the accountability pressure the governance apparatus has been required to respond to in each successive governance decision the arc of the season has demanded. The official ban's formal confirmation and the strongest message language that accompanies it arrive at the end of that arc is the governance apparatus's most formal and most institutionally complete disciplinary response to the most severe single physical incident the arc has produced, and the specific institutional content of the strongest message language is the analytical key to understanding both what the governance apparatus's disciplinary response has accomplished and what the governance accountability story still needs to accomplish to be complete in the way the Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands require. Let us start with the specific content of the official ban announcement and the strongest message language that accompanies it, because the precise institutional claims the governance apparatus is making in its most formal and most severe disciplinary action are the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the strongest message framing as the confirmatory conclusion of the governance accountability story without examining what the specific institutional content of that framing actually says about the governance apparatus's understanding of what the ban's issuance represents as a governance accountability action. The official ban announcement includes several specific institutional components that each tell you something about the governance apparatus's current institutional state and about how completely it has processed the full scope of the Accountability Coalition's demands. The first component is the formal confirmation of the permanent competitive exclusion of Carrington from the WNBA's competitive ecosystem, which addresses the individual conduct dimension of the Accountability Coalition's demands by removing the specific individual whose assault on Cunningham produced the most severe physical consequence and the most extreme disciplinary response in the league's governance history. The second component is the institutional language characterizing the ban as the strongest message in WNBA history, which addresses the deterrence dimension of the Accountability Coalition's demands by formally establishing the governance apparatus's own assessment of the significance of the disciplinary action in the context of its institutional history. The third component, which is the one the mainstream coverage is most consistently failing to examine with adequate analytical attention, is the specific institutional language the governance apparatus uses or fails to use in connecting the ban's issuance to the broader governance framework failures the Accountability Coalition has been most specifically and most urgently demanding the governance apparatus formally acknowledge and address through the comprehensive institutional reform that the arc of the accountability season has been building toward as its most consequential destination. It is the presence or the absence of that third component in the strongest message announcement that tells you the most about what the ban's issuance has and has not accomplished in terms of the complete governance accountability transformation the Accountability Coalition has been demanding. Now let us talk about why the strongest message language is the most analytically significant element of the official ban announcement, because the specific institutional framing of the governance apparatus's own characterization of its most severe disciplinary action tells you precisely how the governance apparatus is understanding the relationship between the individual conduct the ban addresses and the governance framework failures that created the conditions for the conduct to occur in the severity the Carrington assault represents. The strongest message in WNBA history framing reflects one of two possible institutional understandings of what the ban represents, and the specific content of the announcement's language determines which understanding is actually operating within the governance apparatus's institutional processing of everything the Accountability Coalition has been demanding. The first possible understanding is that the strongest message is being sent primarily to individual players about the consequences of individual conduct that exceeds the most extreme acceptable boundaries of the competitive environment, in which case the ban is understood primarily as a deterrence action directed at individuals who might consider engaging in comparable conduct in the future, and the governance framework failure dimension of the Accountability Coalition's demands is understood as having been addressed by the demonstrated willingness to impose the most extreme available disciplinary consequence. The second possible understanding is that the strongest message is being sent to the governance apparatus itself about the institutional consequences of the governance framework failures that created the conditions for the most severe individual conduct to occur without the adequate deterrence that proper governance would have produced, in which case the ban is understood primarily as the most extreme expression of a governance failure that the Accountability Coalition's demands require the comprehensive institutional reform to prevent from recurring, rather than simply the most extreme expression of individual conduct that the deterrence messaging is intended to prevent from recurring. The distinction between those two understandings is the most important institutional distinction in the entire official ban announcement, and the specific language of the strongest message framing is the analytical key to identifying which understanding is actually governing the governance apparatus's institutional processing of the Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands. Now let us talk about what the official ban means for the broader governance accountability story and for the institutional legacy of the Clark era's most dramatic season, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is treating as the concluded chapter of a governance accountability story rather than examining as the most important indicator of how much of the story's most consequential institutional work remains ahead. The official ban's formal confirmation is the necessary institutional foundation for the governance accountability story's most consequential institutional chapter rather than its conclusion, because the governance accountability story is not complete when the most severe individual disciplinary consequence has been formally confirmed. It is complete when the comprehensive governance framework reform that the individual conduct most severely expressing the governance framework failures has been formally and bindingly implemented in a way that changes the institutional architecture through which every future physical conduct situation in the WNBA's competitive environment is governed. The ban is the most necessary individual governance action the accountability story has demanded from the governance apparatus. The comprehensive governance framework reform is the most consequential institutional governance action the accountability story has demanded, and the specific relationship between the official ban's formal confirmation and the comprehensive governance framework reform's formal implementation is the institutional relationship that determines whether the strongest message in WNBA history is a complete governance accountability statement or the most dramatically severe individual governance action in a governance accountability story whose most institutionally important work is still ahead. Remember the specific element of the official ban announcement that tells you the most about how much of the governance accountability story's institutional work is still ahead? Here it is. The specific presence or absence of formal institutional language connecting the ban's issuance to the comprehensive governance framework reform the Accountability Coalition has been demanding is the single most important analytical indicator of how the governance apparatus is processing the full scope of the accountability story's most consequential demands. And that presence or absence is the element that the mainstream coverage is treating as the confirmatory conclusion of the story when it is actually the most important measure of how complete the governance accountability transformation the entire season has been building toward actually is in the institutional state the official ban announcement reveals. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the official ban and the strongest message language, and why together they matter beyond the immediate institutional significance of the most severe single disciplinary action in the WNBA's governance history. The specific institutional accountability the governance apparatus has accepted through the official ban's formal confirmation is substantially different from the specific institutional accountability the Accountability Coalition has been demanding throughout the arc of the season's governance accountability story. And the gap between those two forms of institutional accountability is the governance accountability dimension that the strongest message framing most effectively obscures through its emphasis on the severity of the individual disciplinary action rather than on the completeness of the institutional reform the accountability story has most urgently demanded. The governance apparatus has formally accepted individual disciplinary accountability through the ban, establishing through the most extreme available sanction that the most severe individual conduct violation in the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season will not be tolerated in the WNBA's competitive ecosystem going forward. What the strongest message language does not establish, unless the specific institutional content of the announcement formally includes the governance framework reform commitments the Accountability Coalition has been demanding, is the institutional accountability for the governance framework failures that created the conditions for the assault to be possible and the severity it produced without the adequate deterrence that proper governance would have provided. Those are two different forms of institutional accountability, and the governance apparatus's formal acceptance of the first does not automatically constitute its formal acceptance of the second, and the distinction between the two is what the complete governance accountability story the Clark era's most consequential season has built most urgently requires the governance apparatus to formally address before the strongest message in WNBA history can be said to constitute the comprehensive Institutional transformation. The Accountability Coalition's most demanding voices have been most specifically and most persistently requiring throughout the entire arc of the season's governance. Accountability story. The second hidden angle is the specific commercial implications of the official ban's institutional content for every stakeholder in the Clark-era commercial ecosystem whose commercial investments in women's basketball's governance integrity are organized around the specific governance accountability standards the Accountability Coalition's demands have established as the minimum adequate institutional framework for the WNBA's most commercially significant era. My verdict on the official ban and the strongest message in WNBA history is this, stated without any qualification or hedging. Dijonai Carrington being officially banned after the assault on Sophie Cunningham represents the necessary institutional foundation for the governance accountability story's most consequential chapter but not its conclusion, and the strongest message in WNBA history is the most institutionally significant individual governance action the Clark era has produced while simultaneously being the most important indicator that the comprehensive governance framework reformed the Accountability Coalition has been most specifically and most urgently demanding throughout the arc of the season's governance accountability story remains the most urgent and the most institutionally consequential governance action. The WNBA's most dramatically revealing governance accountability season has not yet formally produced. The first reason this verdict is correct is the individual and institutional accountability distinction. The official ban formally accepts individual disciplinary accountability for the most severe individual conduct violation in the Clark era's most dramatic season without necessarily constituting the governance apparatus's formal acceptance of institutional accountability for the governance framework failures that created the conditions for the violation. And the distinction between those two forms of accountability is what the complete governance accountability story most urgently requires the governance apparatus to formally address. The second reason is the strongest message's institutional content. The specific institutional language the governance apparatus uses to characterize the ban as the strongest message in WNBA history is the analytical key to identifying whether the strongest message constitutes an individual deterrence statement or the comprehensive governance accountability acknowledgement the Accountability Coalition's most demanding voices have most specifically been requiring, and the specific presence or absence of the governance framework reform language in the strongest message announcement is the measure of which characterization is institutionally accurate. The third reason is the governance accountability story's completion standard. The governance accountability story is not complete when the most severe individual disciplinary consequence has been formally confirmed but when the comprehensive governance framework reform that prevents the individual conduct most severely expressing the governance framework failures from recurring through the institutional changes the Accountability Coalition has been most specifically and most urgently demanding has been formally and bindingly implemented, and the official ban's formal confirmation is the necessary institutional foundation for that reform rather than its completion. The strongest counterargument is that the official ban and the strongest message language together represent the appropriate institutional response to the most severe single physical incident the Clark era's governance accountability story has produced, and that characterizing the strongest message in WNBA history as an incomplete governance accountability statement risks setting an institutional standard for governance completeness that no single governance action could meet regardless of its severity and its institutional significance. That argument has genuine merit as a governance proportionality concern. The counter to the counter is that the governance completeness standard the Accountability Coalition has been demanding is not disproportionate to the severity and the institutional significance of the governance failures the arc of the season has documented, but is specifically calibrated to the institutional transformation that preventing the recurrence of the governance failures the Carrington assault most severely expresses requires, and the strongest message in WNBA history is the most dramatically severe expression of the governance apparatus's individual disciplinary authority without necessarily being the most institutionally complete expression of the governance accountability transformation the Accountability Coalition's most consequential demands require. So tell me in the comments right now, Does the official ban of Carrington and the strongest message in WNBA history represent the complete institutional transformation the Clark era's most consequential governance accountability season has been building toward, or does the distinction between individual disciplinary accountability and institutional accountability for the governance framework failures the arc of the season has documented remain the most important governance accountability gap? That the official ban's formal confirmation has not yet formally closed? Drop your answer, because this is the governance accountability question that determines whether the strongest message in WNBA history is the conclusion or the foundation of the Clark era's most consequential governance accountability chapter.